Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome one and all to Water's June 8th, 2021 tea with Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes. Happy summer to everybody in the Northern Hemisphere. Most of us are feeling the heat, and winter in the Southern Hemisphere for those who are with us from Oz. Best wishes for LGBTIQ Pride Month. We're delighted to see Diane has her flag background up. Thanks, Diane. As you know, our program today is entitled What White Feminists Need to Know About Intersectionality, and I think it will be a challenging and educational hour for us. Water programs are all aimed at supporting and igniting social change. They're not just get-togethers and drink tea and have fun, although we certainly do that, but they're really meant to support and ignite social change. Whether in theology, ethics, or ritual, Water's efforts are geared to bring together solid academic scholarly data with the activist commitments shared by those in our alliance. And so we're delighted to welcome you, Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes, to our table because you do just that, bringing a wealth of studies and experience, both in religion and psychology, to the work of social transformation, especially anti-racism and anti-sexism. So you are a welcome guest today, and we hope that you will come often. Here's the format for those of you who are new to the Water tea experience. I will give a brief introduction to Dr. Walker-Barnes. She will then take 20 to 25 minutes to say something about her work, and then we will have an opportunity for questions and discussion, to which all of you are welcome to raise your hand and ask your question or make your comment. So that'll be a really dynamic part of this time following the equally, I'm sure, dynamic remarks from Dr. Walker-Barnes. We close officially at the top of the hour, which here on the East Coast will be 3 o'clock. Though we keep this Zoom link open so we can stay in conversation with one another if we wish to, or ask questions that we wanted to ask but time did not allow. I have, of course, invited Dr. Walker-Barnes to stay as long as her schedule permits, but we're deeply grateful for this hour of her time. If she can stay longer, that's fine, but she's under no obligation, as you can imagine. We're just deeply grateful for her hour. The video of this session will be on our website at www.waterwomensalliance.org, along with notes. So don't worry if you miss some terms or some spellings or some references, we'll get all those. We'll take notes and share them after Chanequa has a chance to glance at them, lest we make errors or in case she wants to add something after the session. So it's with gratitude that I offer our speaker a warm welcome on behalf of all of you to Water. Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes is a licensed clinical psychologist as well as a public theologian. She's an ecumenical minister whose work focuses on identifying and healing the individual and societal legacies of racial and gender oppression. These will be part of our focus today as we look at what white feminists need to know about intersectionality. She writes of herself, and I quote, "Beyond the classroom, she spends most of her professional energy writing and ministering to clergy and faith-based activists. Her faith has been shaped by Methodist, Baptist, and evangelical social justice communities, as well as by Buddhism and Islam." She was ordained as a part of an independent fellowship that holds incarnational theology, community engagement, social justice, and prophetic witness as its core values. I'll say those again: incarnational theology, community engagement, social justice, and prophetic witness as its core values. She currently serves as Associate Professor of Practical Theology at Mercer University School of Theology. I know with the delight with which it was announced recently that she will soon become part of the faculty of Columbia Theological Seminary, where she'll be Professor of Practical Theology and Pastoral Counseling. Dr. Walker-Barnes also belongs to the American Psychological Association and the Association of Pastoral Theology, and she's on the editorial board of the Journal of Pastoral Theology. You may have seen her name associated with a very powerful piece, Prayer of a Weary Black Woman, which caused some right-wing pundits to accuse her of racism. What? She responded with a tweet that should have stopped them cold. She wrote, "The folks critiquing have clearly never read Psalms other than 23 and 100, because then they'd recognized what it's modeled after, what her prayer is modeled after." Her tweet didn't stop the torrent of opposition, and some continue to bray and moan about her work, but the work shines, as you know if you have read the chapter we distributed. Racism is not a standalone issue. Dr. Walker Barnes is the author of Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength from 2014, and more recently, a book that I like very much, and I highly recommend for your reading, Summer, Fall, Winter, Spring, I Bring the Voices of My People, A Womanist View for Racial Reconciliation, published by Erdmans in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 2019. And here's what we had to say about it. You know, on our website, there's a section called What We're Reading, and here's what we had to say about the book. This is an important read for people working to overcome racism and white supremacy. Dr. Walker Barnes makes clear in chapters entitled, Racism is not about feelings or friendship. Another chapter, Racism is not a standalone issue, the one that we offered you. She makes clear that racism is a matter of power, which needs to be dismantled. This analysis we wrote is not intended to make white people feel the least bit comfortable. Rather, it is a direct call to forget cheap grace reconciliation and warm, fuzzy feelings and get on with the business of making substantive structural changes. Amen. So we invited you, Dr. Walker Barnes, to bring your wisdom and your grace to this WATERtea. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We look forward to your words, and we are now in your capable hands. Welcome.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I see my friend and seminary classmate, Sarah Job, among you, and others that I don't know, but I'm just delighted to be able to spend this time with you. And I'm just going to jump right in it. I have a brief presentation to make, and I want to make sure we have plenty of opportunity for conversation, because I find that usually in these discussions, it's the dialogue that really kind of comes alive. And so I just put in the chat a copy of the presentation for those of you who might need to zoom in. It might be easier to follow in that way, but I am going to share my screen. All right, so today we're going to talk about what white feminists need to know about intersectionality. When I got this invitation, I was delighted, have heard about water for a long time. And I began to think about the places that I've been where I've seen the term intersectionality used in ways that are not quite accurate, often by white feminists, male, female, non-binary. Often white women, LGBTQ people. And part of that is intersectionality is a relatively new term. It is about close to 30 years old now. But many people hear about intersectionality, not from reading about it, right? But they kind of hear it in conversation. They learn it through their activism, and it resonates in some ways. But there are a lot of ways in which we use the word that don't hold on to, that don't really adhere to its sort of original meaning and intent. And so I want today to spend a little bit of time talking about what some of the misunderstandings are, giving some definition, and also talking a little bit about the etiology of intersectionality and why that's important. And depending on our time, I'll talk a little bit about how I came to decide to use intersectionality as a key framework for my work on racial reconciliation. So I've seen a few sort of missteps and misunderstandings that people have when they talk about intersectionality. One of the most common, I think, is to equate intersectionality with multiplicity. In other words, to think about intersectionality as in the multiple layers of identity. I've heard people say, all of us have multiple layers to our identity: gender, race, class, ethnicity, nationality, disability status, gender identity, sexual orientation, language, and so on. And there is often a tendency then to say that intersectionality is about how we bring those different components of our identity to bear, how they influence each other. That actually is more consistent with the idea of multiplicity. Multiplicity is what talks about just the fact that our identities are multi-layered. And depending on our context, at times, some parts of our identity may come more to the foreground than others. So if we are in a place where we're the only woman, our gender may be at the foreground. If we're in the place where we're the only American, our nationality may be at the foreground. But there's a way in which at various times we may pull on different aspects of our identity depending on where we are. And there are ways in which parts of our identity impact the other parts. Right? Intersectionality takes it a step further. Intersectionality is not just about the layers of our identity, but it's also about how the different layers of our identity interact with issues of power, privilege, and oppression. So this idea that intersectionality is really keenly concerned with the experience of people who exist at the intersections of multiple forms of oppression. Right. So it's the intersection, not just of identity, but it's the intersection of oppression and privilege. So there are ways in which, as an African-American woman, I have experiences of racism, and I also have experiences of sexism. And because I live at the intersection of those two isms, I also have some unique experiences that are there at that intersection that aren't accounted for by racism alone or by sexism alone. And we could do that on and on and on. We could do that with people who are disabled. We can do that with LGBTQIA people. We can do it with immigrants. We can do it with those who are poor. That when you exist at the intersections of multiple forms of oppression, you are likely to have some experiences that are unique from people who only experience one of those forms of oppression. And intersectionality says that we miss something when we don't pay attention to that. We miss understanding how oppression really works. So that's one issue I've seen. The second issue is what I call, an example of kind of whataboutism. And it's the example that comes up in conversations. I see this in the classroom all the time, where an African-American student may begin talking about their experiences of racism. And perhaps a white queer student might speak up and say, well, you can't just talk about racism by itself. You also have to talk about sexual orientation, right? And what that often does is it decenters the experiences of people of color. And I really have mostly seen this happening when it's people of color talking about issues of racism. So it becomes this sort of rhetorical strategy that is used to diffuse dialogue on racism in the name of intersectionality, right? And that's a misuse of intersectionality. It actually is a way of weaponizing intersectionality against people of color, especially when it happens towards women of color. And that has the impact of this kind of third error, which is decentering Black women and women of color. Intersectionality is a framework, a theory, analytical tool that was crafted out of the experiences specifically of Black women and other women of color. And I'll talk about the genealogy a little bit more. But what has often happened is people will use the term intersectionality without understanding sort of that genealogy and without giving adequate attentiveness to it. I have seen presentations on intersectionality that don't mention Black women at all, actually don't mention women of color at all, which has the effect of rendering women of color invisible in a theory that was meant to center them. And so that's another issue with intersectionality. And that's not to say that intersectionality always has to be applied to Black women and other women of color, but those roots have to be understood, and they need to be understood well in order to apply and utilize the framework appropriately. Intersectionality is not new. Again, the term is only about 30 years old, but the term itself reflects the approaches that Black women and other women of color have been using in their organizing, in their scholarship and activism for decades, for at least a century. And there are a few key texts and figures that we now understand as sort of precursors to intersectionality. We see intersectionality embodied fully in these. So some of these foundational texts, and I think these are important if you really want to understand intersectionality, these are some good starting points. The first is Anna Julia Cooper, and who in 1892 published A Voice from the South. Anna Julia Cooper was born into slavery, and after emancipation ended up getting her degree. I think she had one degree in mathematics. I can't remember what the second degree was in. She wrote A Voice from the South and then eventually went and got a PhD. So she's only the fourth Black woman in the US to earn a PhD, which she actually earned her PhD in, I think, a school in Europe. But she wrote A Voice from the South, and in it, she really articulated the unique role that Black women had in the civil rights movement of its day. So she's writing at the same time as like W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And so he's using his talented 10th philosophy. And she talked about how Black women, that that there were things that Black men could do, but she talked about how because Black women experienced both racism and sexism, that we have a unique vantage point from which to watch the goings on of the US and to come up with solutions that even Black men and white abolitionists could not anticipate, right? And so her book, it's a small little book, but it's a powerful book. And then fast forward to 1981, another seminal text, This Bridge Called My Back. It's an edited collection of women of color across the spectrum in the US. So Black, Chicana, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian American women, and at least one trans man in this book. This book is important because it came about when women of color, a group of women of color, made an exodus from a feminist organization. After both the civil rights movement and in the midst of the women's rights movement, women of color frequently found themselves frustrated by Black men in the civil rights movement, who often told them when they raised issues of sexism, we don't have time to focus on that. That's a divisive issue. We need to just focus on the issues of racism. And they experienced a similar thing when they were in this white feminist organizations that said, we can't focus on issues of race. We need to focus on the issues that affect all women universally. And so in both cases, these women felt like their experiences were not being heard. And they gathered together and wrote this compilation that includes kind of academic theoretical articles, memoir, poetry, and again, it's a powerful book and one of the core texts in intersectionality. The following year, Akasha Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith published this text. All the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. And the title of the book captures intersectionality at its core. This idea that gender issues have been defined by white women, racial issues have been defined by Black men, and that left Black women out of the equation because there are some things that are unique to Black women that only Black women can articulate. And so this was the first book in Black women's studies to be published. And again, it includes a wide range of literature. Jacqueline Grant has a chapter in this. So we see that the womanist theologians were present at these conversations in the very, very, very beginning. A signal text that occurs in both of the compilations, actually, both, but Some of Us Are Brave and This Bridge Called My Back, is the Combahee River Collective statement on racism and sexism. And this was written in 1977 by a group of Black lesbian women who were talking about, again, the experiences that they'd had both in civil rights movements and in women's rights movements. And they wrote, in part, it was our experience and disillusionment within these liberation movements, as well as experience on the periphery of the white male left, that led to the need to develop a politics that was anti-racist, unlike those of white women, and anti-sexist, unlike those of Black and white men. So all of this, really forms the background, it's the foundation of intersectionality. It was in 1989 that legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw was, she's one of the founders of the critical race theory movement. She's one of the organizers of the critical race workshop that was held at Harvard, I think in the late 80s, early 90s. And that was where they came up with the term critical race theory. And around that same time, she published this, this article where she talked about the term of intersectionality. And she gave an example of how the unique role of Black women is overlooked in justice movements. And this role, this example, I've still found very powerful. She was trying to, she was in LA at the time, and she was trying to get data on the number of Black women incidences of domestic and intimate partner violence that involve Black women. And she approached the law enforcement office in LA, I think it was the sheriff's department, and asked them for this data. Can you give me the numbers? How many of your domestic violence incidents are involve Black women as victims? And the law enforcement refused to give her the data. She was going back and forth and trying to get the data, and they refused to give her that data that would identify the racial and gender identity of the victims. And she found that she had two opponents in this. There were two groups. On the one hand, the male-led racial justice activists in the area were opposed to her having the data because they thought that it would make Black men look like they were disproportionately perpetrators of intimate partner violence, right? So they didn't want her to have data on Black women's experiences of intimate partner violence because of their concerns that it would indict Black men. At the same time, white feminist groups in the area that did domestic violence work didn't want her to have the data because they didn't want the data to give the idea that only Black women experience intimate partner violence, right? Because this was at the time when people were actively working to diffuse this idea that domestic violence only happened among poor people, only happened among people of color, right? And so they were against it for that reason. And what that meant was that she was unable to study the incidence of of intimate partner violence among Black women because of the opposition of two groups who were also justice oriented. And so she talked about this idea that sometimes you can have marginalized groups that have competing interests, right? So one element of your marginalization had, when taken on its own, it competes with the interests of another element of your marginalization. So here, anti-sexist work and anti-racist works were butting heads, and it left Black women in a position that resisted telling, I think was the language she used, right? It rendered Black women invisible because you could not focus in on Black women. And so intersectionality then, one of the core insights of intersectionality is that for using Black women as the example, that as a Black woman, there are some elements of my experience that are going to be similar to the experiences of women generally, right? And that includes sexism and the ways it operates. There are some elements of my experience that are going to be held in common with Black men, and I could say more broadly with people of color, but some elements that are going to be more in common with Blackness in general. And there's also a part of my experience that is unique to my position as a Black woman, right? That my Black womanness contributes to my experience in life in ways that are over and beyond the experiences of racism alone and the experience of sexism alone. So I think this is the last one. Yeah, the last one. So there are a few things about intersectionality that are really important, and it has a few key concerns that I think anytime we're talking about intersectionality, we have to keep these in mind. One is that intersectionality is concerned with identity and inequality, and it does not separate those, right? It is always talking about just not what your identity is, but how your identity is bound up in privilege and oppression in different ways. Excuse me. So as a highly educated, middle-class, African-American woman, I experienced multiple forms of privilege, right? In terms of my education, my income, being American, being mostly able-bodied, that kind of changes. But then I also experienced multiple forms of oppression in terms of being not just a person of color, but being an African-American who's the descendant of enslaved peoples, being a woman, right? There are multiple ways in which I experience privilege and oppression. And at any given time, those feed off of each other, they compete with each other, right? They all define my experience in the world. A second key concern of intersectionality is justice. Intersectionality is not neutral. It is always geared, like the gospel, in my opinion, to issues of justice, right? That is its stance. And so whenever we're talking about intersectionality, it's always in the interest of justice and equality, advancing the cause of equality and equity. And at the core, intersectionality begins with the experiences of Black women and other women of color. And it does that in particular because the idea is that, particularly in a world that is both extremely patriarchal and racist, that Black women and other women of color are kind of at the bottom of the bottom. And because Black women and other women of color are in that place, we have a different perspective on the ways in which oppression works, the ways in which privilege works. We have a different vantage point. And if you tend to the most marginal, especially if you add in other layers, if you add in sexuality, if you add in poverty, if you add in immigration status, disability status, that women of color who exist at multiple margins of oppression, if our justice work is geared towards them, it ends up lifting everyone, right? By focusing on the most marginalized, we end up lifting everyone. And so that's another key concern of intersectionality. The final slide is just where you can get more info. And I'll point out on my website, I have a few different resource guides, including one that's about intersectionality. So if you want to read more about intersectionality, I think there might be a couple of videos on there as well, and the ideas of some organizations that do this kind of work. So it's a good resource for that. I'm going to stop the share now. Let me see where we are on time. I'll just mention a little bit how I use intersectionality in my work, particularly my latest book, I Bring the Voices of My People. I spent about 10 years in the Christian racial reconciliation movement, largely in evangelical social justice organizations, the Christian Community Development Association, Sojourners, other groups, and as well as some mainline groups. And one of the things that I often found is that when we talked about reconciliation, the perspectives often centered those largely of Black and white men, and occasionally Latinx and Indigenous men. And then occasionally they throw in one or two white women. And whether it was readings, whether it was panels, conferences, this was the pattern over and over again. And the experiences of women of color were really left out of the conversation. And that shapes the movement in some really powerful ways that are negative, I think. So one of the core ideas in Christian racial reconciliation is that reconciliation is about relationship, right? And so you'd have these conferences and they have like a Black man and a white man on the stage, like hugging it out, crying and be like, we're friends now. And that solves all the racial problems of the world. And so the idea was like, oh, we just need to form more relationships. We need to have more multiracial congregations. And if people are close to each other and in proximity with each other, that's going to fix the whole problem. When I would bring that up with my relatives, the women in my family, Southerners, descendants of slaves, working class, they will all immediately start laughing. Because the women in my family have been domestic workers. They work in nursing homes. They spend a lot of time working and caring for white people, white children and elderly white people, white families, the homes and property of white families. And women of color know instinctively that relationship and proximity do not solve the problem of racism. In fact, sometimes it makes it worse because proximity means that you are actually more vulnerable to racism in the interpersonal sphere. And so it was simply by excluding the voices of women of color, particularly I think Black and Latinx women, that the racial reconciliation movement missed this whole idea that relationship alone is insufficient, that what we're talking about are patterns and systems and ideologies that impact us at a deep level, right? Even down to particularly the politics of beauty. It was another issue that was not talked about at all. The issues of women's sexuality and sexual agency, right? That all of these things were bound up in our conversations about racism, but you could spend years in these settings and never hear mention of any of those things, right? You just heard people, men primarily, saying, we need to get people in the churches together and singing together and praying together, and that's going to fix it all. And so I think the perspectives of women, and I think women broadly, help to enrich our understandings of race, right? The perspectives of women of color help us to see some of the nuances of race, but also the perspectives and experiences of white women help us to see some of those things too. In the recent backlash over prayer of a weary Black woman, and this comes from a book that was edited by Sarah Bessey, who's a white Canadian woman. And she and I have talked just briefly about the different types of pushback that we both got, right? We both got pushback, but it's slightly different because the pushback is about, for me is what that Black woman did. For her is what that white woman allowed that Black woman to do, right? And both of these tell us something profoundly important about how racism and patriarchy work. And so intersectionality invites us to probe that at a much deeper level so that we can understand what oppression looks like, so that we might begin to understand what it takes to get to a just world. So with that, I'm going to stop so we can spend time in conversation.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Chanequa Walker Barnes, whose most recent book I'm hawking shamelessly today is called I Bring the Voices of My People, a Womanist Vision for Racial Reconciliation. And we have just heard a very synthetic and informative presentation on much of what is in this book, concluding as you did, Chanequa, with what really is part of the first chapter, racism is not about feelings or friendship. And I think that your conclusion is a very helpful way of starting off our discussion, because you're absolutely right that it is not about feelings or friendship, but the hard work that goes into dismantling structures of power that we all live in. And those of us who are white live in a very different relationship to power and privilege than those who are Black and other people of color. So you have given us I think, a very clear and comprehensive view of intersectionality. And you have pushed us in a, without any apology whatsoever, to begin with the experiences of Black and other women of color in our use of that term going forward. And I thank you on behalf of all of us for not only the book, which is published, by the way, in 2019 by Erdmans, but also for this presentation. And please, friends, we will make available the video of this so you'll have access to this very, again, very concise and clear PowerPoint. There can be no mistake about Chanequa's view of these things and how very helpful it is. Dr. Walker-Barnes, very helpful to all of us. So with that, I would like to open the floor for conversation. Annalie, would you be so good as to inform us on how to do that so that people can comfortably join the conversation? Janet Bourne, I see your hand up. Why don't you start? And please give your name and maybe where you're from. That helps us to situate ourselves and to know one another a little bit better as we do this work. So Janet Bourne will be first from Ohio.
Yeah. I'm from Ohio, retired professor from University of Cincinnati. And just as a side note, knew Patricia Hill Collins and got to interact with her a little bit in the Women's Studies group. Anyway, but that was a long time ago. My question is this. First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. My question is this. As I've entered my 80s, I've noticed ageism has entered into my consciousness more than it ever had. And I wondered, I'm sorry, I haven't read your book. Do you deal with ageism as Black women and women of color, and how that might be different than how we women of white women experience? I don't know. I just wondered how you might speak to the issue of ageism within the context of your studies.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And I will admit, I don't talk about that and bring it in. Excuse me. For the book, I decided to focus on race and gender pretty exclusively. But I think it raises good points about the way in which, excuse me, women's authority, spiritual authority, women's experiences change over the lifespan as we get older. And yeah, that's, even you raising the question of it, I'm fascinated by it, and we'll probably pay more attention to it now, right? To see if there are, because I already think there are variations in how women experience aging over how men experience aging. Hollywood gives us this example over and over again, right? George Clooney will be considered a sex symbol forever. Sean Connery, right? Like as men age, they get more opportunities, right? But recently, like there was news over Kate Winslet deciding not to get airbrushed and all that stuff for her latest film, right? Because that just doesn't, those opportunities aren't given to women as often. So no, I haven't looked at that, but you've made me curious now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Janet Bourne. And we'll look forward to that in a future publication, Dr. Walker-Barnes. Who will be next?
Dr. Walker-Barnes, I'm so appreciative of your educational work for varying audiences. And I know that some of the resistance that I've heard of that you've encountered. My question is, do you find responses to these ideas when you make a presentation differ according to the audience who's there? Do you find it differs by, say, white women, who in my experience tend to be defensive, and Black women who tend to be grateful, and mixed audiences? Would you touch on that?
Yeah, and I think, it varies by race and gender. It varies also based on ideology, right? What I find among Black audiences is like, well, yeah, duh. Like, no surprise here. Among women of color, because I do a lot of work specifically with women of color, diverse groups of women of color, what I get is a sense of relief, right? That in some ways their experience has been named for them, something that they sort of instinctively knew but couldn't articulate. And so there's oh, that explains what I've been dealing with. From white audience, it really varies depending on the ideology. there are some for whom there's tremendous pushback, right? Tremendous pushback and defensiveness. But there are others who also, I think, because, you know, I devote a chapter to trying to explain what to do about whiteness, because this is another thing that the racial reconciliation movement does not touch. It just doesn't want to touch what to do with whiteness, right? And so to try to name that for white people, I find that many white progressives are actually open to that because it gives them something tangible to hold on to, because so many white progressives, they want to know what to do, right? When they learn about racism, they're like, okay, now what do I do? And they want some type of action. And so part of what I point to is look at your own culture and how it shaped you to be white, right? And that gives people something to hold on to. So I found even there also not relief, more troubled, but troubling in a good way. Like, oh, now I really got to wrestle with this. But yeah, thank you for that question. And also, I love your Sankofa bird in the background.
Okay, Ricky, would you be next? And then is it Sia Noyes?
Hi, so I'm Ricky. I'm in San Diego. And my question is, I've come across, I mean, specifically, it's been people who are advocating for like queer advocacy, and then those that are looking at and touching on racism. And the question from one group to the other of, well, your focus on queer folk is taking away from the time, energy that people can spend addressing racism, or the opposite. And I was just wondering how you thought of that in terms of, is there opposition? Is there a way in which, I mean, how would you address people with those concerns, I suppose?
Yeah, this is where the competing interest thing comes in. And it comes out of this mentality of scarcity, which is a kind of capitalist idea, right? So I think, you know, the way in which we've seen the civil rights movement work, the women's rights movement work, is very much this: if we're going to give out justice, we'll mete out it to these groups, but at the expense of somebody else. And sometimes among marginalized groups, that same idea pervades, that there's only so much to go around, and so that we have to fight for it, right? I think that actually serves the interests of a white supremacist patriarchal capitalist world, right? It doesn't serve our interests. And so part of what we have to do is learn to provide space for all of those, right? So when the organizing I've done among women of color, what we do, we've had a couple of retreats, is we provide space for every ethnic group to meet individually, to talk about your individual issues, and then we come back as a big group. And we try to learn from each other and say, oh, you all are dealing with that? Oh, we didn't know that biracial women were dealing with that. Oh, Indigenous women, oh. And we get to see the similarities, but we also get to see the distinctions. And we get to see the places where our interests as Black women might rub up against your interests as Latinx, but we can actually name it because we've at least provided space to explore it. We don't always know what to do with it, but at least we've named it, right? And we can also see, okay, here are the places where we're joined together and where we can build coalition. And I think we've got to learn how to do that.
Thank you. And Sia Noyes, and just to say that in the chat, there are a number of good comments, including one from an Irish colleague saying how helpful this is even across the pond. So just to let you know, Dr. Walker-Barnes, you're having an impact beyond the immediate audience here. So Sia Noyes, would you go ahead?
Yes, and I apologize when you asked for it. C, like
C.
C.
Yeah. Got it. My apologies for mispronouncing.
Oh no, everybody does that. I should have spelled it differently. It would have made life easier. Okay, so when you were talking, I realized a problem I have. I teach. I teach at a very small liberal arts college in Michigan. And I teach a lot of social theory and cultural theory. And so getting into intersectionality, I find the biggest problem I run into is that conflation with multiplicity. But it really wasn't until you started talking that I realized that that's like my brick wall that I start hitting is how do I explain that to my students? Otherwise, I'd have done this work before I asked you this. But can you, is there anything you could suggest I look at or read that would help me better inform my ability to explain that difference to my students? I get it, but I still have a problem conveying it properly, I guess is what I should say. So
Thank you.
thank you.
I think Kimberly Crenshaw's TED Talk on intersectionality tends to be very helpful. It's less dense than her article is. So I think she does a good job. Another good resource is Vivian May's book, Pursuing Intersectionality. And I'll write it in the chat.
Great. Thank you.
She gets
Thank
at
you.
what some of the misunderstandings of intersectionality are.
Great.
We'll also be taking notes on all of these, and so we'll send out this list of resources that both you've given Dr. Walker-Barnes and people put in the chat as well. So don't worry if you don't have a pen and paper here right now.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question or make a comment, actually. As a predominantly white organization like WATER, one of the ways in which we have learned to do some of this work is not expecting that women of color will come to us, but that we will form coalitions with, for example, Black-led groups rather than expecting Black women to come to us. And one of them, of course, is the Center for Womanist Leadership and Ministry in Richmond, named after the late, great Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon of blessed memory. And we are finding that as to be led by those women. The newsletter coming out from WATER is a report of the conference that you and I, Dr. Walker-Barnes, talked about that took place by that center a couple of weeks ago, and also the one that the women of Pan Autumn, the Pacific Asian and North American Asian women's group, did on their ministry. And so would you comment on that? I mean, it's not an either or, either groups like this become more diverse in terms of race, but it's a both and, I think, with because I'm very sensitive to the notion that we as white women would have any expectations or put upon any of our sisters of color, especially Black women, to explain to us things that we need to learn ourselves. And yet it's that conundrum. I just wonder if you have any comments on that, or do you sense that we're moving in the right direction in what I've just described, or am I missing something major here?
Yeah, I think I actually like the strategy of, I don't think there's anything wrong with diversifying an organization, right? But it's hard to do that. And for one thing, I think many people of color, and maybe it's all of us, like there is this element that I notice particularly among African Americans, but I think is there among other minoritized groups, of this thing I call resonance. There's something, and I haven't figured out quite how to explain it well. There's something about our culture, it's part of a call and response. There's something that's evoked only when there's significant numbers of us in large, like it has to reach some kind of critical number. I don't know what that number is yet, but there's something that is only pulled out when we're in a collective together. And that's something we can't take with us. This is, it's where this idea of code switching comes from. Code switching isn't just a conscious thing. It's because when I'm in a predominantly white context, I can't get that thing I need that lets me bring out that element of my culture. But if I'm in a room full of Black women, that thing is going to come out, right? It happens naturally. And I just don't know that we have access to that without that sort of critical mass. And so for that reason, I think there's a real advantage in kind of going to, right? White women going to groups that are led by Black women, by Asian and Asian American and Asian Canadian women, by Indigenous women. And I think there's reason for us to go, even women of color, for us to go to each other's groups and spaces, because there is something about the way in which that it just only gets evoked when we're together. The Womanist In Gathering at AAR SBL every year is different from any other meeting at AAR SBL. And we cannot know each other and get, and it just happens. So yeah, I think it's helpful for that reason.
Great, thank you. Other comments or questions? I have a list myself, but I'm sure others have them. Sarah?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Dr. Walker Barnes. It's good to see you again. So I have a question, and I hope I can say it well enough. But I'm wondering if you have any either tips for how to move forward well, or things that you see go characteristically wrong by those who might want to try to name the way that often poor white folks generally can get invisibilized in academic conversation. And then, my heart, but maybe everyone else doesn't. So I work in prisons. I work in women's prisons, both as a practitioner, as a chaplain, and as a scholar. So, my thought is the way that white women get invisibilized in carceral conversations. So do you have like tips or tricks, or you see it go wrong in ways of like trying to name that invisibilization and lift some of those veils, but while trying to do it from an intersectional frame that refuses to drift from the roots in Black women's experience? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think one of the things that needs to happen most in the US is poor white people need to be able to analyze their complicity in the project of whiteness and to name their class oppression, right? And to figure out how they have often participated and doubled down on the project of whiteness as a way to deal with their class oppression, right? I think there's a lot of self-hatred among poor white people, and they haven't had a way of naming that, right? And so naming that class oppression, naming like white trash, naming that term, and understanding its role in the project of white supremacy is critically important. And it is hard for poor white people to do that. So what we see now is why do we have over and over again in these questions of racial and economic justice, do we often see poor whites take the side of wealthy whites, right? And part of it is because they think they can transcend their poverty. They can transcend their class oppression by adhering to white privilege, right? And so I think trying to find some way of articulating something different. And I think a place where this happens is actually empowering poor and working class people to lead more. Because some of these conversations about class happen when Black and white and other races, poor and working class people are laboring together. They have conversations about the system then, right? But then it sort of fizzles as the poor white laborer gets maybe some taste of white privilege and maybe manages to break through that and then leaves behind everything else. And I think developing a critical consciousness, it's one of the disappointments of J.D. Vance's book. I really had a hard time with that book because he kind of reaches the point of just blaming poor white people, and he doesn't do the class analysis and looking at the way poor white people are used to uphold the system, right? We need people to do that work. And I think until we get people to do that work, you're always going to be able to have the white elites, especially those on the right, who will be able to co-opt those people to be the face of their hatred and hostility and to work out their issues. What that looks like, I don't know. I know there are some attempts to do it. There have been some attempts to do it at like the labor organizing And I think that might be the place to enter, is to look at how labor organizers have done that work and how we can do that and bring a race consciousness to it as well.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for the question. I'm going to just ask one last question and then we'll close officially. And then if those people want to stay on and talk, that's great too. But I was deeply struck by your comment in the book. The critical issue for white Christians is not how they embody their humanity when the legal system supports justice, but how they do it when it doesn't. I thought that was one of the most provocative and profound statements in the book. It's not how they embody their humanity when the legal system supports justice, but how they do it when it doesn't. And you were referring there to the South African apartheid struggles and the eventual conviction of de Kock, and who was the head of the police, who claimed that he was following the law and was lauded later when he did good things following the law once again. And this was on the basis of the interviews by the great scholar, Dr. Pamela Gobodo Madikizela, who happens to have been a dear colleague of mine. Would you be so kind to say more about that? Because I think that has implications both in terms of Black Lives Matter, struggles within churches, certainly around the police violence. Can you just say a little bit more about that, just as a kind of tease into your next book maybe, or as we move into further conversation? Because I think that is a profound insight that people need to hear.
Yeah, there is, I think part of the way that whiteness has been framed in this country is that a critical component of white racial identity is following the ethos, following social norms, right? Because that's part of how you prove yourself white. Historically, how people prove themselves white was by adhering to whiteness. And what that means, I think, very often is that even among white progressives, there is often this tendency to base one's social ethics on whatever the law is, whatever the authorities say, whatever the social norm is. So, 2-3 summers ago, when the law and the ethos was on the side of police, people were overwhelmingly on the side of police. And then last year it changed, right? And it became hip to be a protester. And so then people shifted their allegiance, but I don't know if it actually changed people's views. I think they just went with where the social norms were going. So it became seen as everybody's protesting now, everybody's on the side of Black Lives Matter now. And so that's where people threw their weight. But if the pendulum swings again, and it will, because it always does, right? If it swings again, I think what is going to happen is all those folks who were buying the books and doing the church reading groups and going to the protests last year, they will just go back to life as normal. Because what hasn't happened is that white people really begin to articulate a sustainable opposition to injustice and a sustainable pro-justice orientation, especially one that requires them to break the rules, right? And this is, I'm assuming this is a gathering of rule-breaking women. So you probably know the resistance.
The hands go up. Yeah. I'm looking at some who have actually been incarcerated for breaking the rules.
Yeah, so you know,
Kathleen tells I'm looking at you.
Yeah, and have seen women who might think the system is wrong, but they are never going to break the rules. Right? They got to do what the rules say, because that's what it means to be a good person, to be a good Christian, to be a good Christian woman. And so that part really disturbs me, because I think, if the right wing were to have its way and were to be victorious, I think most white Americans will go along with it. Right? Whatever, if they institute some of these draconian measures, I think most white Americans will go along with it because they go along with whatever the system tells them to do.
Okay. We will
and
continue.
That's terrifying to me. And I just want to, it terrifies me.
Thank you so much. And I think you are, as they say, spot on in that insight. And I know that you're spot on in the other insight out of the South African situation. So I wish you weren't, because I think you're right. I want to thank you very deeply, Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes, for being with us as our guest. Look at you can see the applause, and we'll make sure you get a copy of the chat so you can read some of the comments. We will put together notes, my friends, that will help us to not only revisit, but also to socialize this resource among ourselves and among our groups and communities. It has been a rich hour. You'll be able to listen to this at www.waterwomensalliance.org under WATERteas. And we will have upcoming water programs that I will mention, but the audio video of this will be available, as will the notes. So you'll have plenty of resources. And also, let me say one last time that this book, I Bring the Voices of My People, really is an excellent starting point for many people for this conversation. And it will take, the subtitle is A Womanist Vision for Racial Reconciliation. And I think your experience, Dr. Walker-Barnes, with racial reconciliation work that doesn't work shows clearly in this book. And you point the way to some things that you think, and I happen to agree with you, may, and we just need to do the work. So even though it's not perfect, one of my questions for later was really, what about people who haven't even started doing any of the work yet? I hope to see you either at the meditation on Monday, at the book talk on Wednesday, or the following Tuesday at our liturgy. And I, in the meantime, wish everyone a very wonderful day. And I hope that Dr. Chanequa Barnes will come back and be with us. Walker-Barnes will come back and be with us again. And we send you strength, that we adjourn today with gratitude to you, and we wish you strength in the struggle to deal with the white supremacy that surrounds and the racism that abounds. And we will look forward to being colleagues of yours in that struggle. So thank you so very, very much. The Zoom will stay open for those who'd like to continue in conversation. And I know you have other questions. So please just, we are officially closed for those who want to leave gracefully, and we'll continue the conversation. So go right ahead, folks. Please don't be, yes, please, Pat, go ahead. Pat Newcomb.
Okay, well, we haven't had a chance to ask Dr. Walker-Barnes about any further feedback from this delightful poem that appeared in Prayer in Rhythm. And perhaps you could just give a quick snippet of what you thought you were going to get and what you got.
Yeah, I can talk about that, and then I'm going to have to go in a few minutes. But the backlash to that prayer was unexpected in a lot of ways, and part of that, the success of the book was unexpected. When this group of women, Sarah invited us to write this book, we thought, oh yeah, these are basically our friends and people who kind of follow us will pay attention to this book. Nobody else is going to pay attention to this book. And so we were really writing, thinking of an audience that was, trying to deconstruct their faith in a lot of ways and reconstruct it. And so we thought it could a little bit, but, part of it is that because of our political climate, where you have folks actively trying to incite a race war, they are really cherry picking a lot of issues. And so for me, it was, being a Black woman, it was that particular language that I use. And I think it was also my location at my current university, Mercer University, which has a very unique role in sort of the Southern Baptist world as a former Southern Baptist institution. That was the first Baptist institution in the nation to give benefits to domestic partners. And so split with the SBC and even our Georgia Baptist Convention over that years ago. And so it's kind of been, an outcast in that way. So I think a lot of things just coalesced in that. It was scary at a point. Quite honestly, my family, we had to move to a hotel for about a week because of concerns about doxing and violence. We have sort of figured out how to adjust to this new normal, but privacy and safety are now issues for me in ways that they had not been 2 months ago. And, constantly questioning, even like how things like this, okay, how's this set up again? What are you going to be doing? Who's going to be monitoring the chat and monitoring who comes in? And so that part, and part of that is but this is the tool of white supremacy, is surveillance, right? And what we see now is the right is unabashedly engaging in this all over the place. And so it's one of the tactics of intimidation. And so there's always a challenge and a struggle between safety and privacy and still doing the work, right? And trying to figure out, okay, how much do I do? How much do I put out there? But I think it's a strategy that they're using all over the place. And so it's important for people to be aware of it and to recognize that anybody at any time can be targeted if you happen to meet, kind of what their needs are at the time. It kind of is independent of what you do and what you say. At the same time, I think the prayer has sparked incredible opportunities for dialogue. And so, it's one of those things where I think what they meant to harm might actually work out for good. The sales of the book went through the roof. But I think, I've had some conversations with people where they're like, I wouldn't have heard of the book. Or I had heard of the book, but hadn't bought it. And, and I bought it and I read it because of what was going on. And so I think there are ways in which that can happen too. But I think we have to really learn how to be sharp as serpents, right? When it comes to this, that there are a lot of bad actors in the world. Our tendency has been to think that racism is just kind of an accident, like Europeans tripped up and enslaved people, oh, look at that, wait, we made a mistake. But no, it wasn't an accident. Jim Crow wasn't an accident. Lynching wasn't an accident. There have always been people who intentionally want the world to work this way and everybody else who just stays silent. And so we have to decide what kind of people we're going to be. And so, yeah, I think if anything, it gives people a chance to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we will put the citation for the prayer from the book, A Rhythm of Prayer, a collection of meditations for renewal, in the notes for this. And we will also make reference to the prayer so that people can get a hold of it, read it. You're being rather modest, though. In fact, the book became a New York Times bestseller. And it's available in Target and places like that where, real people read real books. And so I think part of it may be some jealousy too on the part of these people that some of their tracks just haven't gotten any traction, as it were. But I even found myself going to look up the notion of the Psalms of imprecation. I mean, that's really where you came from, was the Psalms that 5, 10, 17, 35, 58, 59, all those Psalms that the imprecatory Psalms that I had either not known or forgotten about. And basically let those be ashamed and dishonored. Let those be turned back and humiliated who desire evil against me. I mean, you're right in the heart of the movement there. You're on the strongest biblical grounds in terms of the piece that you wrote. And poor souls that didn't do their biblical study, right?
Yeah, those songs keep me grounded, right?
Absolutely. There's so many. I didn't realize there were so many of them. There are at least 10. I mean, It's really amazing.
And they're harsh. Some of them are really harsh.
I know those babies, and I mean, there's some really difficult things there. But you're in that tradition, and for people to try to deny you your voice out of that tradition is really very telling. That leads me to ask you one other thing about the relationship between some of this and the Trump politics that we have, that we still see seeping around and so forth. How do you read that? I mean, do you see that in terms of, especially those who are still supporting the Trump ideology? Where does that fit with the religious piece that you're working with? I mean, you must see that up close.
Yeah, I think in some ways, the emergence of the Trump phenomenon, right? And before him, the Tea Party, it reinforced some of my deepest suspicions, and many of us, about this country, was that racism hadn't really gone anywhere. It had just gone underground because it was no longer popular. Again, right? It's not popular to voice these things, so it had gone underground. And so that sense, I, though, even in all my wildest dreams, did not suspect that we would get here. I just didn't expect it at all. I I'm really fascinated and disturbed, especially by my white students. One reached out to me a couple of days ago, a graduate, and said, I can't talk to my mother anymore. Like she's fully hook, line, and sinker, falling into that Fox Trump world. And he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. That part has been heartbreaking to me. And to see that the project of white supremacy turns people against their own children, right? That they literally won't listen to their own children. And I don't know what we do with that. But I think we've got to be much more intentional. There is a very much a cultish element to it. And one of the things I struggle with, because Christianity is the culprit, right? As in Rwanda, Christianity was the culprit. As in South Africa, Christianity was a culprit. And it forces me to wrestle with my own faith in some ways, like, okay, wait, what are we doing here? Because yeah, we could, Christianity continues to be the culprit in some of the ways that other religions are not. Right. And yeah, I wrestle with that. What does that mean for my own walk? What does that mean? And what does the church at large do about that? Because I don't think we can just write it off and say it's just one element of the church. No, this is the church. If anything, those of us who have more explicit justice orientations, we're the outsiders, right? We're the outliers in the church, particularly in the US context, I think. So yeah, I think we have to figure out what to do about that. And I don't have an answer for that. I wrestle with it. Yeah. Some days it's embarrassing to be called a Christian. Like it's just because increasingly that segment is the image that people think of.
Yeah. Many of us from the Catholic tradition, not all of us by any means on this call, but many of us from the Catholic tradition experience that over and over and over again in the most distressing ways on so many issues, including now the effort to prohibit President Biden from receiving communion, for example, or the no same-sex blessings, or the ordination of women through, as it were, extra legal terms and so forth, being now on the same plane in canon law as pedophilia and other kinds of crimes. I mean, those are things that we and not to mention the lack of leadership on anti-racist work that so many in our church have failed to exercise to the extent that they might. So that's
one more thing to say before I'll have to get off, but the thing that gives me hope in that regard is thinking that Jesus knew we were going to screw it up and came anyway. Right? Like Jesus knew, was like within a couple of decades they're going to have this all messed up.
We've not disappointed him, that's for sure.
And so I'm like, okay, if you loved us enough, knowing we were going to screw it up, all right, I'll keep going with you people.
I think we're just left giving you a bunch of jazz hands.
Yes, thank you.
I think so too.
Thank you for taking us.
Thank you so very much. And come again.
Thank you so much. It's been great. Thank you all.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.